Okay, thank you all for joining online and also in the conference room. We are gathered here to have a roundtable, a conversation on African studies, or what we have called engaging Africa. In academic discourse beyond disciplinary divide and specialization, we have been using the term African studies. In a few weeks, actually in less than 2 weeks, Cologne will be hosting the European Conference on African Studies. Ibadan hosts an Institute of African Studies. The University of Cape Town has its Center for African Studies. Like the US, the UK has its own conference on of African studies. This list of evocations of African studies can go on and on. What do we actually mean by mobilizing such a conceptual construct or a category? How do we make sense of it, and what do we intend to do with that? Current debates about decolonizing Africa, in Africa, in Africa, the US and Europe have brought to the fore issues related to epistemic imperialism, requiring a reflective move on the part of academia as an institution of knowledge production and transmission. What are the implications of those debates for the ways in which we have engaged Africa in academic setting? To what extent do these debates concern the organization of academia in terms of disciplines, centers, or institutes? One of the pressing demands in those debates has been to decenter and open up the largely Eurocentric global academia to other perspectives, and in particular other forms of thinking, conceptualizing, and knowing. The critique here draws attention to the degree to which academia has been uncritical of many of its theoretical orientations, analytical tools, and collaborative frameworks. Fundamental questions emerge then about what ideas of discipline, Africa, and knowledge can we mobilize and contribute to these demands? In Europe in particular, the demands for decolonizing have pushed for the restitution of artifacts in order to restore them in their authenticity. In other contexts, the concern has been about an epistemologically sound, ethically viable, and politically just institution. We would like to discuss here, in this round of senior Africanist scholars working in different disciplines and based in Africa and also outside of it, what does an insistence on those mean for the future of African studies? How do we, as scholars engaged in Africa, position ourselves, and how can we best address these recent challenges and demands? These are my introductory notes, but I would like to say it's a coincidence that today is the Africa Day, right? Yeah. So let's see what we can manage to have in terms of conversation here. Before I turn it to, we turn it to the presenters or round tablers, if I can put it that way, I would like to give the floor to Kai Kresse, who would introduce some of them, and perhaps even say a few words on the whole agenda of today's roundtable.
Yes, thank you, Abdulkader. Thank you so much for participating in our roundtable, and this also to the audience here in the room and online. I think we are so glad to be able to pick up on this opportunity to kind of reflect on these dynamics of how and pathways forward of how to best sort of position oneself and how to constructively engage and push forward a research agenda and an understanding of Africa in its diversity and multiplicity. And maybe that's one keyword, just as a note. We all know how internally diverse and multiple Africa is, and with its 1,500 to 2,000 languages or so alone. So one sub-point that I just wanted to flag up as part of introduction, which we may or may not return to, is also the link to languages and then subfields of studies. So I've just returned from a conference of Swahili studies in Bayreuth, where not only was it the first after 3 years of Corona absence of the conference, but I think it really, for me, it's also something to think with as a particular different and unique environment there in Bayreuth, where scholars who use Swahili as a research language convene every year, and half of them being, round about half of them from East Africa, and many of them mother tongue speakers, many second tongue speakers of East African. And the conference itself shifts around different kinds of themes and shifts between English and Swahili throughout. So for me, this is one way also in which a kind of research and conference practice sort of shifts or takes a kind of different note and pathway, and a way in which also, you know, Ngugi's point, however we kind of see it, and I think there's a need to criticize as well as praise for that, but the way in which just this thing of switching these two languages or drawing from them equally among a community of scholars, researchers, and students gives it a whole different dynamic and sort of an equal footing. So I just wanted to flag up this one thing from my conference experience just now. I would also ask the audience after our first round of discussion to be ready to put in their input, to be on their toes while listening to the first round of proposals. And I think with such, we can basically turn over to our introduction of our speakers, right? And I'll start presenting Professor Insa Nolte, who is there on the right hand. And just to say a few words, she has a past in Berlin, so she's an alumni of the FU Berlin with a degree in something else. And then she switched over. She's been for a long time now based to Birmingham, in Birmingham, first at the Center of West African Studies, and then also doing her PhD there with Karen Barber, and having gone through the different stages, now a full professor of anthropology and African studies. She's been one of the editors of Africa, the Journal of the International African Institute. She's had a period of being the president of the UK African Studies Society. And actually in that context, in 2018 or 19, published a programmatic piece on the future of African studies in the Journal of African Cultural Studies as well. Her monograph on Olufemi Awolowo and the political and religious effects of his biography, an important Yoruba intellectual, it came out in 2009 with the International African Library series. And and I have one recent volume of her here to show, Beyond Religious Tolerance, Muslim, Christian, and Traditionalists Encounter in an African Town. So also the very conscious attempt to think and work comparatively on the religions in the Yoruba context, which is also the theme of her current research and work on a monograph, for which she is here in Berlin at the VICO, the Institute of Advanced Studies over in Grunewald. And I could say many more fantastic things about her, but we want to listen to her rather than hear about her. So welcome, Insa, to our round. Abdulkader will introduce the next speaker, and then we will.
Okay, the next speaker is Professor Olutayo Adesina from the University of Ibadan, Nigeria. He is the head of the Department of History, has written extensively on Nigeria, on the Southwest, I would just mention here two contributions he has made: Oyo History, Tradition, and Royalty, University of Ibadan Press in 2021, and Nigeria in the 20th Century, Cornell publication in 2007. This is his second time at ZMO, and of course, he has seen what we do here and the kind of questions we are asking, and hopefully he would engage some of those questions that we have today, especially coming from Nigeria and being based in Nigeria. Thank you again, Professor Adesina, for accepting to be part of this panel.
Yes, and our third speaker and invited guest is Abdulkader Tayob here to my right. He's been with us now since early March for this year. Abdulkader Tayob has been for the last 3 years now, and for another 2 to go, our Alexander von Humboldt George Foster Award holder. So we're really happy about this ongoing research relationships, and we've known him for quite some time before. A professor of religious study at the University of Cape Town with a PhD in Islamic studies. He's been a crucial figure in the field of the study of Islam in Africa, where he brought many strings and strands together, and people, for most of all, young and old. So I think this kind of fermentation, bringing together ideas and people, that Cape Town with the funding from the South African grant there as a research chair, I think it was. I've also brought one book here, Religion and Modern Islamic Discourse, that was published in 2009, a recent monograph. Maybe not so recent anymore, but he's published lots of other things since. And there I wanted to say that, wanted to flag up one publication that addresses sort of the kind of theme directly. That was published in 2018 in the Journal of the Study for Religion, an essay on decolonizing the study of religions, Muslim intellectuals and the Enlightenment Project of Religious Studies. Again, I could say so many more things, Abdulkader, but we want to hear you speak. So I hope this is okay as by means of introducing you. Thank you.
The fourth professor we have at this table is Professor Launay. He's professor of anthropology at the University of Northwestern, and he has contributed a lot in the study of Islam in West Africa in particular, and in anthropological theory. Just to mention a few of his contributions: Beyond the Stream, who is studying Islam in West Africa, who has not read that book? Islamic Education in Africa, Writing Boards and Blackboards, Savages, Despot and Romans, The Urge to Compare and the Origins of Anthropology, Foundations of Anthropological Theory from Classical Antiquity to 18th Century. So as you see it from the publications, we have a chef here. So welcome, Professor Launay, and we are happy to have you here, and we can't wait to hear what you would like to contribute to this conversation. On this note, perhaps we can just turn it over to our 4 speakers, and then we would like to start with Professor Nolte. So, what do we have for us?
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me, Kai and Abdullah. I'm absolutely delighted to be here at the ZMO in the company of such esteemed colleagues. And as the first speaker, I should comment on this position. As Professor Adesina might note, it is the small masquerade that opens the performance, right? So please bear it in mind. I prepared my comments partly with this in mind when I saw the program, because I am actually very sure from the caliber of my fellow speakers that they will focus very much on Africa and perhaps have things to contribute that far extends what I could contribute, although I'd happy to speak about this. So I will focus very much on issues that I see as problematic in the European research context in relation to this field. And before I start, I'd just like to repeat that my own interest and also experience draws on broadly two sources. My research and collaboration with Nigerian colleagues, which involves an affiliation I'm very proud of with Osun State University. And obviously my professional career, mostly both in Germany and mostly in the UK, and obviously my engagement with this question in this role. You know, that is, as all perspectives, a limited perspective and one that's clearly embedded in broader inequalities to start with. And these broader inequalities are what I'd like to focus on today. I read with great interest the wonderful introduction by Kai Kresse and Launay to their recent book, Thinking the Rethinking of the World, in which they emphasize that the decentering of perspectives from the West relies on careful dialogical engagement rather than distinct positions, and thus highlight the implicitly collaborative nature of theorizing. That is certainly my own experience, but without talking about this in too much detail, I would like to say that I'm also very much aware that this is my experience because as the holder of a permanent academic post in a relatively well-to-do UK university, I was able to take the time to do so, to think carefully, to build relationships with African colleagues, even if some of my managers were unhappy with the time this took. So what I'd like to raise here is not really the intellectual content of dialogic, collaborative, and conceptual work, but the conditions that support or enable it. And I would like to suggest that in the UK, as in Germany, there's a wonderful debate, a very fascinating debate taking place at the moment. And this has led to the establishment of some structures and processes that really support this process. For example, debates about reading, referencing, publishing African authors, and concerted efforts to include perspectives from the continent in peer review processes of publications, grant applications, and so on. However, there are also a number of limits in terms of this environment. And I would like to start with what I think of as the most dangerous one, and that is the precarity of academic careers, which makes it especially difficult for early career scholars in a European context, but very often also in African contexts, to build up and maintain the relationships of trust that allow them to engage in dialogic exchange and reflection. Obviously, there are very different reasons for this that are worth thinking about, but I think it's really worth bearing this in mind. In addition, the slow and painstaking nature of collaborative rethinking against the dominant arguments can impact academic careers, especially for those not yet chairs, because it delays publication in a highly competitive field. Very often, those of us most earnestly committed to such work find it hardest to meet the criteria of so-called excellence in terms of publications, you know, just having the list. And so I think, you know, there are two ways out of it. One is to simply accept decolonization as something that has to be performed. And the other one is to also think how we can create the conditions of thinking of academic work that really support this intellectual project. While funding pros, in addition, I'd like to say that In my experience, while funding processes often support collaborative and interdisciplinary work at the outset, this is not always taken into account in broader evaluative and administrative processes. So in the UK, for example, we have the Research Excellence Framework, which assesses the quality of departmental outputs every 7 years, rather biblical, but which focuses strongly on disciplines and thereby foregrounds and reinforces disciplinary boundaries, which, as we all know, largely reflect the intellectual history of Europe and North America. In addition, assessment based on outputs often obscures or silences the time-intensive work of collaboration with colleagues from different academic, cultural traditions and who speak different languages, which involves much patience, understanding, and mentoring in both directions. And finally, ever increasingly difficulties in terms of visa and travel arrangements often further complicate collaborative work by delaying or limiting time for such collaboration. I am less well qualified to speak about Germany, but I would like to say that I have formed the impression, we can talk about that this is at least to some point, that at least some of these points also apply here. Obviously, you have a very long ongoing debate about academic precarity. I am also interested to see to what degree evaluation processes, for example, associated with clusters of excellence, itself a highly competitive concept, can capture the time-intensive work of communication and collaborative thinking. My understanding of the visa process at the moment is that things are much easier than in the UK in principle here. However, the reality of the past 8 months here has also shown me that that actually matters very little if one doesn't get appointments. So I do think that all these issues, form part of the broader environment in which we need to think about our work. And you probably guess where this is going. I do think there's an important way in which our intellectual project links to broader political engagement. I would like to point to the importance of collective action. In the UK and Nigeria, for example, academics are unionized, and with all one might want to say about that, I think that is an important form of arrangement, is an important platform for discussion and debate. But of course, we can also share our experiences and concerns in learned societies and associations, including the ECAS conference next week in Cologne. And of course, in our capacity as individual scholars and representatives of our discipline in relation with funding bodies, governments, and government institutions, and so on. My final point is that I do not think, as academics or people interested in academic debate, such interest should focus on academia alone, although it's very important, and that we need to engage with broader public debates, in particular about the representation of Africa in the UK and Germany, but also on the African continent. As that is really the only chance for us to contribute to a meaningful future that includes our own intellectual ambitions.
Thank you very much, Insa. And I think we'll switch over right to our next speaker. So, yeah, second speaker then, Olutayo.
Okay. Thank you so much to Abdullah, to ZMO for bringing me here. It's my pleasure to be here and also seen Insa Nolte after 10 years or so. Nice to be here. So let me just quickly make a footnote to where she stopped, and that's the issue of visas and embassies. She fought so many battles in the case of visas for people coming for African studies meeting in the UK that I'm sure she's exhausted. But it's not getting the appointment that is getting the appointment, going for the visa interview, and your visa not coming out until 2 weeks after the event that you are billed to attend. So at the end of the day, you have your visa, nowhere to go. So there are issues that we must resolve when it comes to academic engagements short-circuited by political process or consular inefficiencies, or even deliberate consular approaches. Because at times now when you think about immigration, they look at you and say, you don't look like somebody who will return. How do you know? You know, so I'm happy to be here, especially as somebody who has come from a tradition that significantly battled what you call Eurocentrism in scholarship. I am from Ibadan, and we all knew about, well, maybe the older generation knew about the Ibadan School of History's contribution to the decolonization of knowledge. But now the catchphrase about African studies now is decoloniality. And I said, okay, the decolonization process that went on in the 50s and 60s, when did we lose it? That we are now returning to decoloniality. And so these are the contradictions that we find when we walk our way back intellectually from the present to the past. And so we begin to see the misalignment that has gone into the intellectual engagements by different generations. Looking at what happened to African studies, Ibadan School of History actually began the process of African studies. Because looking at the Department of History at Ibadan, the publications that came out of that department had to do with history, had to do with religion. In fact, it started the Arabic Studies Department, you know. And so, in its pristine beginnings, the Ibadan School of History encapsulated the kind of African studies we want to see now, which is not happening. It's not happening because a lot of issues had gone ahead to actually affect or influence what is happening in these so-called African studies. So what is African studies? What are they trying to do with it? What kind of knowledge is coming out of these institutes? What kind of knowledge production is coming out? These are things that we have to look at and re-engage because it's not because of the economy that so many people are now living in Africa. They are also in search of knowledge. They are in search of meaning to existence. So if you are in Africa, you are teaching African studies, they don't see precisely the arguments. They don't see the theories. In the past, all these things took the form of advocacies, ideologically revolutionary, people fighting a cause. Say, this is what we believe in. This is what we intend to do. This is our trajectory. But now, a lot of things have gone wrong with the process of education, that people just go to school now for certificates rather than for the ideas that they could bring out of the process. As a result of this, our students have actually started to question the validity of what is coming out of several of these institutions. And so now they look outside, find what they are looking for, and they move. So at times the embassies also got it wrong, thinking that they are moving for moving sake or running away as economic migrants, but it's much more than that. When we were undergraduates, the most important thing in historical scholarship was causation. But nowadays, the students are not so much interested in causation as much as the meaning. For instance, when we were undergraduates, we were taught the history of Mali with Mansa Musa, a very rich king, showcasing the wealth of Mali, taking much gold out of Mali to Mecca. And of course, when he got to Egypt, he spent so much money for the poor in Egypt to the extent that the economy of Egypt collapsed. Okay, so we were taught that yes, Mali was rich, the king was rich, but now if you teach the same subject now in that way, they don't see what you are talking about. But if you tell them that the profligate nature of African leadership has a long shadow, has a deep root, and you start from Mansa Musa, then they begin to connect. See, okay, this thing has been going on for so long. Taking the wealth of Africa out of Africa, to service people in other lands to the extent of affecting the economy of other people. So the search for meaning is much more important for them now than either rote learning or you want to glorify a past that they could not engage with. So the question now is, and so what? Several people have now started dealing with the question of and so what? Because it's an inquisitive generation. It's a generation that has access to information, to knowledge, and they are better prepared than the students of 10, 15, 20 years ago. So they have also started to question the intellectual content of what we teach because they have access. So African studies in the present situation itself is in a crisis. It's in a crisis, one, because the people who teach do not have access to fellowships. They don't have access to up-to-date books. They don't have access to travel and engagement conferencing. And for as long as this continues to be like that, so long would African studies on the African continent, especially south of the Sahara, will remain underdeveloped. If you also want to engage in research, you want to do public books, of course, it's very important for us to engage with the international scene for fellowships, but we know how competitive these are. And so if you are writing for a fellowship application with a book way back in 1980, then you already have a problem. The foreign exchange problem that many of these countries are facing have made it very, very difficult to purchase current books and journals. Hardly will you find universities actually subscribing to journals. Hardly. And it's because the foreign exchange problem in these countries have made it almost difficult for universities to survive the current prevailing economic situation. And to make matters worse, we are all saddled with governments that are anti-intellectual. And once these problems are there and you want to buy books and journals, they don't understand why you should use the hard-earned currency to buy books and journals. So anybody who is engaging the international environment is doing it with his or her own blood. It's not because the system is supportive. Of course, it might be different in South Africa. But that's not the case in Africa south of the Sahara, Black Africa, so to speak. So we have to then understand that the intellectual in Nigeria, in West Africa, is actually going through a series of problems, a series of issues that has made him or her largely less competitive than they would have loved to be. But that's not to say that it's a static environment. No, we have made certain progress. We have engaged. We have also started to rebuild the fabrics of the intellectual environment. And now we are also welcoming people from abroad. We have signed links agreements that have started the process of cross-fertilization of ideas. And these have become very significant in the restructuring process of African studies. So as things also go on, we are sure with younger, brighter people joining us, because our students are training abroad, and surprisingly, some of them are coming back home. So we hope that with more of them coming back, then we'll begin this relaying of the foundation that would also help us to cope with the challenges that we are facing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Adesina. The next, Professor Tayob.
So thank you very, very much for organizing this event. I have sort of become quite privileged, or at least spoiled, getting these opportunities to reflect on ideas, coming here, spending a bit of time, and then also getting the chance to present some ideas for critical discussions. I really appreciate doing this, and also especially in the light. So I'm going to follow up on some of the issues that have been spoken about, but through a research project, and I know a book is long time due, through a book project that I've been working on for a couple of months, and I've used the opportunity in the last couple of months to give it a bit more shape. And today I thought I can share some of that with you and speak about its connection to Africa, to the study of Africa, but also its connection to decolonization. So I'm working at the moment on a project on moral economies in African Muslim societies, where I am looking at a number of economies in different parts of Africa. And I'm hoping that that I'm going to collect some of these ideas, put them in a book form, and reflect on the question of moral economy in the context of neoliberalism. So I want to begin by sharing with you, how I've come to this decision to look at moral economies. I started about 10 years ago on a project on religious education. After focusing for most of my career on the study of Islam in South Africa, East Africa, and to some extent West Africa, individual essays, I decided that I should look at religious education in South African schools and engage with the discipline, but also make some recommendation. One of the results of this engagement was to realize that there was a misfit between what the study of religion was doing in the academy and what the religious education was promised, in South Africa as well as in other African countries post-colonialism. I also had an opportunity to engage with religious education in Europe, and I also realized that one of the central features of religious education was to actually produce moral and upright citizens. And yet, so I saw that as a kind of as an ethical project, whereas I saw that religious studies was actually not engaged in any kind of morality or ethics as such, not as a primary consideration. Religious studies has been engaged, from Schleiermacher onwards as questions of experience or questions of the sacred. Since Foucault, we have spent a lot of time speaking about power, but very little or not as a central component thinking about ethics as such. So I took that as a kind of a critique of the discipline, also my own discipline, to begin to engage in the in this study as such. I'm not going to give you the full story, but eventually I ended up with moral economies, particularly through the reading of critical scholars like, I think David Graeber played a very important role in our research group, who's written quite extensively on, contemporary economy in his book called 5,000 Years of Debt, and also his earlier book on money, on I think 2001. I don't remember the title right now. But also Hannah Arendt's work on, the human condition and things like that basically help us to start thinking about where do we start from. And I've settled with, for the moment, on this concept of moral economy, first coined by E.P. Thompson as such. And this idea is to start looking at more carefully the kind of economic values and economic practices that have been cultivated in societies, particularly before the onset of colonialism and since colonialism, in resistance to colonialism. So that's the sort of one trajectory of thinking about moral economies. I must also say that the other way of approaching the subject is that I've engaged also with a reading of classical Islamic literature on what we would call economy, because that was not called economy at the time. It was called often, ways by which people make a life or achieve a livelihood, ma'ash, to live, for example. And they have lots of deliberations in law, in ethics, in theology also, about how to basically live your life as an economic being. I mean, what we would call an economic being. So I basically looked at that archive certainly in a critical way. I'm not necessarily saying that we should take everything from there, but actually as a point of departure in order to start looking at these practices. So I chose the sites that I chose are guided by kind of economic practices that were deliberated upon, that were debated upon in the intellectual history of Islam for which to work. I think this project that I'm working on at the moment benefits considerably from the kind of decolonization discussions and debates, an ongoing project, I would say, still at the moment. But I think certainly I cannot do this project without thinking about, its decolonial connections as such. Now, as I said, as I've mentioned briefly, I think decolonization is an ongoing project, like many of you are engaged in as such. I think there are three areas for me that are quite important to take from there. Not all of with which I agree, but certainly I'd like to begin first with the first element of decolonization. Is the fact that decolonization should be completely separated from post-colonial thought. People like Walter Maniolo emphasize that position very strongly. The idea that post-colonialism is still wedded to a kind of an intellectual project of the global north, to put it simply. And I think that decolonization is emphasizing this kind of delinking from the past as such. I think that's an important consideration to think about, although I'll come back to that point a bit later. I think the second element of decolonization is a recognition of the persistent hegemony of a world that is created during colonial modernity. So if one thinks about, and decolonization even goes beyond the Enlightenment, beyond the 18th century, all the way to the 15th century, to the rise of empires, through the so-called voyages of discovery, as we used to learn about in school, and that we need to think about that hegemony having a much more far-reaching impact than others, including, as scholars in the study of religion, working with decolonization is emphasized, including a very intense form of dehumanization through questions of race, or at least through classifications of race, where they see basically race and religion playing a very close role in that way. And I think the third dimension is to think of alternative theoretical frameworks that one is to look at, in the condition that we find ourselves. The theoretical frameworks so far that I've seen are suggesting that because of the way that theory provides a way of seeing the world, of actually providing a map for the world, one needs to have different concepts, different ideas from which you can see the world. And those concepts and those ideas need to come not from the global north, but actively be sought in the global south in order to see the world, in order to see the world anew. So if that is decolonization, I'd like to make some concluding comments, not not short one or two, but concluding comments on how I think the moral economy is basically engages with this decolonization, which I think is quite valuable, and I think needs to be looked at a little bit more carefully than I have seen so far. I'm saying that decolonization has not really addressed the question of economy, except for speaking about the economics of production, which actually falls very much within a capitalist framework as such. So first of all, I think that it is certainly true that, you know, the first, at least my, I think the first point I want to make was make a comment about this shift between, or at least this apparent disconnect, or at least apparent difference between post-colonial and decolonial. I sort of can see the value of the idea of delinking, but I think that it sort of conflicts with the second part, which speaks about the persistent hegemony of the contemporary world. And so I think that in order to fully grasp the hegemony that we are, that is in the present world, I think one needs to begin with the understanding of the capitalist economy. I mean, I'm seeing a sort of a shorthand for a complex economy, but certainly an economy that is particularly pervasive, that is very, very extensive, and actually, you know, brings forth the kind of hegemony that I think even the state system or even the perception of the world actually doesn't sufficiently cover. So I would say that thinking about the way the economy, the capitalist economy, at least how it has incorporated Africa, for example, in the 19th century, from the 19th century, other places before that, you know, with certain simple practices and certain ideas is actually much more hegemonic than that we cannot ignore when we think about decolonization. I think that the second part of it, so that's the point I'm trying to make about the fact that one cannot completely ignore the post-colonial, because the post-colonial gives us very good insights about how that particular hegemony has actually been established. So one of the small but important insights that I read in Samir Amin, for example, who says you can have many different states, you can have different ideas, identities, but you cannot have two economies in the modern world. It's all one economy. So I think that just captures, I think, the value of the post-colonial, even though we might not agree with everything Samir Amin says later. I think that secondly, my reading of economics in general and particularly moral economies, but I have spent a lot of time reading about economics as such in the last 2 years or so. It seems to me that particularly when one looks at it from being in Africa, that on the one hand, the capitalist economy basically spreads, you know, persistently and just includes more and more social worlds. But at the same time, it also acts by exclusion as well. To the extent, if one looks at the history of migratory labor in South Africa, you know, you draw people into the as migrant labor into the mines, and then you spill them out back into the Bantustans in the old apartheid state. I think that's a very good description of the exclusion of sections as they are being included. So on the one hand, you basically promote, I've read quite a bit of essays now on the process of financialization as is promoted by banks, modern banks in Africa. But at the same time, this financialization is including people, but also excluding them by not giving them the kind of benefits of capitalism that should come with financialization as well. So I'd like to keep this idea of exclusion in mind as I'm exploring this question of moral economies. And finally, I think that thinking from this archive of thinking about the economy, of thinking about trade, or thinking about endowments, thinking about various kinds of practices. I'm not excluding the slavery in Islamic tradition as well. But thinking about this gives me an opportunity to recognize people who are often excluded from these economies as they are included as well, but also recognizing their aspiration to think from these kind of resources as well. So I'm hoping my project is not only going to be a kind of a representation of what they're doing, but also engaging with them to think through these ideas in a way by drawing onto this intellectual tradition and seeing it continuing in the present. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Abdulkader. And so now with this, we ask our final discussant, Professor Robert Launay.
Thank you so much, Abdullah, for inviting me to the ZMO. You have very generously called me a sheikh, so I will hope that by the end of this, you won't all conclude that it's a blank sheikh. I confess that I'm rather cowed by my role as a discussant, as an old, white, straight American male. To be asked to talk about decolonization seems to me somewhat questionable, if not paradoxical. I thought at the very least, I would try to make the best of my age. I must insist, because my age has made me wiser, my wife and children have long since disabused me of any such illusions. But rather because I have had the time to experience a different world, and particularly I am thinking of the first decolonization. When I grew up, there was a map that hung in my parents' home, and the continent of Africa was mostly pink and green. Pink was British Africa, green was French Africa. So I very distinctly remember as a child and as an adolescent the process of decolonization. And somewhat later, when I went out to do my doctoral research, it was still a moment where decolonization, the first decolonization, was in the process of working. This was in Côte d'Ivoire, which, as you know, was at the time the jewel in the crown of what has since been called France-Afrique. And it was only when I got there in 1972 that the Department of Ethno-Sociology, as it was called, was being officially Africanized. When I got there, the director was a Frenchman, Claude Perrault, and while I was there, the leadership had been transferred to an Ivorian, Georges Nyangaran-Bois. Even here, the question of what this really involved was open. In principle, the head of the Department of Ethno-Sociology was responsible for vetting all the research that was done by, I should say, some foreigners, because they had to renew their visas. This was true of Americans. At the time, the French did not need a visa to come to Côte d'Ivoire or to do research, and they did not need to go through the Department of Ethno-Sociology. As a matter of fact, there was a villa, not a villa, a compound in Abidjan of Alstom, as it was then called. It's changed its name. I forget exactly to what, but the Office de Recherche Scientifique et Technique d'Outre-mer, the Office of Scientific and Technical Overseas Research. Outre-mer was originally French colonies, although since Côte d'Ivoire was no longer a French colony, but it was still overseas in more ways than one. The research institute, the researchers had villas in Abidjan and wherever else they chose to do research. They had massive research budgets. They had not only cars, but chauffeurs. They had the wherewithal to hire research assistants. And all of this was not at all in the control of the Department of Ethnosociology, which could exercise its veto power over relatively indigent American graduate students. So here, clearly, with the whole process of decolonization, as all of my colleagues have mentioned in one way or another, power is a crucial variable. And it exists certainly in projects of decolonization at several levels. It exists within academia, of course, in terms of gatekeepers. That is, who has the power to decide what constitutes excellent or worthwhile or feasible research. Unless these structures are changed in some sort of a way, then decolonization in any full sense is impossible. But it also exists within a much broader national and international arena. Coming from the United States, I am all the more aware that in certain states of the United States, it is now forbidden in primary schools, secondary schools, and increasingly in universities to talk about things like critical race theory, queer studies, or indeed about race, gender, and sexuality in general, much less about Africa. So there is a censorship which, of course, comes from centers of power, which, as Professor Nolte rightly stresses, we academics have to resist, but I dare say we don't resist from a position of power. I hope that you're not thinking I'm too cynical. As it turns out, Georges Nyonga-Rambois, who was the first director of the department, was also some years later the intellectual architect of the ideology of ivoirité in Côte d'Ivoire, Ivorianness. And here we have the paradox of what kind of decolonization we are calling for. I mean, in one hand, what could be more decolonial than insisting on Ivorianness? Except that, of course, the notion of Ivorian itself is predicated on colonial borders. And in addition, this ideology of Ivorianness was an ideology aimed at excluding people, but the people it was excluding were not Europeans and Americans. The people it was excluding were Africans, Muslims. So we have to be very careful what we wish for. And how we achieve it. I am at times puzzled and troubled by the notion of epistemological decolonization. First of all, it assumes that there is some nice, neat European epistemology, generally a European epistemology that is reduced to, well, imperialism and enlightenment. My own project is to try to, among other things, complicate this. I mean, if we want to escape European ways of thinking, in the first place, we have to know what they are. And this is not an easy or an obvious project. But the next question is, what can we replace them with? One solution, the easy solution, of course, is to demolish the academy. I mean, one of the problems is we live in disciplines. I mean, African studies, I mean, the very notion of Africa is epistemologically European. I'm reminded of one of my Chinese graduate students who came from Hong Kong to Chicago and said, it's only in Chicago that I realized that I was Asian. I never thought of myself as Asian, but of course, in the United States, if you are Asian, and African is again a European term with its own history, and all the disciplines, whether this is philosophy, religion, anthropology, sociology, history, political science, you name it, these are all European disciplines. And so it seems to me it's impossible to decolonize fully, in some sense, disciplines that are intrinsically European. On the other hand, if the alternative is to demolish the academy, then I will also say that right-wing politicians in the United States, and I dare say in Europe, are very enthusiastically for this project. So if we demolish the academy, what are we left with? I don't want to sound negative. The question, though I do, I'm sure. The question then is how we can proceed. And the other day I was discussing a particular African novel with Abdulkader, and it seems to me to suggest one way out of the conundrum. It's a novel called The Sons of Independence in English, Les Soleils de l'Indépendance in French, by Ahmadou Kourouma. And Kourouma explicitly categorized his novel as an attempt to bastardize the French language. The title is an indication. The Sons of Independence. Sons is a literal translation of the Mande word tere, which means sun, but it also means day, and it also means period. It's an ironic title because in the novel, the Sons of Independence are anything but brilliant. But the novel is a novel. That is, it is an essentially European genre, and that cannot be changed. But it is also an attempt to creatively hybridize the novel. And it seems to me that what we're calling decolonization might be more cogently seen as a form of hybridization, one that opens up knowledge to concepts that come not only from Europe, but elsewhere, without necessarily rejecting, as opposed to profoundly modifying a framework that is originally European. Not because we like it, but because what else can we imagine? And unless we imagine something else that is satisfactory, then I guess we are stuck with some of these European ideas. But we can hybridize them and add, meld all other sorts of elements that can transform them in fundamental ways and become more inclusive and more just. There are, of course, ways of doing that that are neither inclusive nor just, as the example of equality might suggest. Thank you.
Thank you so much, the four of you. This was incredibly inspiring. Thank you, Abdullah, for pushing us to do this. And thank you, everyone, for participating. Do you want a final word?